The lights inside Joel Osteen's megachurch in Houston were dazzling as always, reflecting off the polished stage and the expectant faces of thousands. Cameras lined the aisles, ready to broadcast another evening of encouragement and positivity to millions around the world. But that night was different. For the first time in American history, the man stepping onto that stage was not a preacher, not a celebrity, but a soldier turned president. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Traoré, only in his 30s, carried on his shoulders the weight of a nation torn by war, a people struggling for dignity, and a continent demanding its voice. He was known in Africa for his fiery stand against terrorism and foreign dominance. Yet here he was, standing tall under the bright American lights, staring across at Joel Osteen, the smiling face of prosperity gospel. Nobody in the crowd could have predicted what would happen next. Many expected polite words, a diplomatic exchange, maybe even a message of unity. Instead, what followed shook not only the church, but also the millions watching online. Traoré did not smile. He did not flatter. He spoke with the voice of a soldier who had seen suffering, with the heart of a man who had buried too many of his people. Christianity, he began, was never meant to be theater. Christ did not die so his name could build empires of wealth. He died for truth, for justice, for sacrifice. The crowd gasped. Joel Osteen's trademark grin flickered. For the first time, America's most famous televangelist was face-to-face with a challenge not from politics, not from critics, but from a young African president unafraid to call out the misuse of faith. And so the question lingers. When truth is spoken so boldly, will Christianity shift back to its roots or continue down the path of comfort and commerce? The church in Houston was full, every seat taken, every camera light glowing red. Joel Osteen was in his element, surrounded by an audience eager for his message of hope and abundance. But this night was not going to be like the others. On stage with him stood a man who embodied a completely different world, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a soldier who rose to power not with polished speeches but with the grit of combat, the discipline of sacrifice, and the unshakable duty to protect his people. For many in America, Burkina Faso was just a name on the map, a small landlocked country in West Africa struggling with poverty and war. But for Traoré, it was home. A land of farmers, teachers, and families who had endured decades of instability, corruption, and terror. He was not there to entertain nor to flatter. He came carrying stories carved by hardship. When Joel welcomed him with a smile and a soft Texan tone, Traoré answered with silence first, then words that cut deep. "I will not come here to flatter. I have come here to speak truth, even if truth is uncomfortable." The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the weight of thousands realizing they were not about to hear another sermon of comfort, but a confrontation with something raw, something real. Traoré spoke of his country. He told of villages where mothers whispered prayers while putting children to bed on empty stomachs. He described farmers who shared half their harvest with neighbors because survival was never meant to be a selfish act. And he reminded the audience that in Africa, Christianity was not a show on stage, but often a lifeline in the darkest nights of war and hunger. He shared a story from his own childhood. As a boy in a small village outside Ouagadougou, he remembered his grandmother kneeling every night in prayer, her hands rough from work, her voice trembling as she asked God for strength. She did not ask for wealth, he said. She asked for justice. She asked for peace. Those words, whispered in a mud house under a leaking roof, shaped the man he would one day become. And now, decades later, he was speaking them again, but on a stage watched by millions. Then he turned to Joel Osteen. With eyes steady and voice calm, Traoré asked the question that pierced deeper than any applause line. If Christ walked into today's megachurches, would he recognize his message, or would he see empires built in his name but not in his spirit? The crowd stirred, uneasy, waiting for Joel's response. He tried to smile to remind the audience that positivity was not wrong, that encouragement was good. But Traoré's reply was sharper than steel. Encouragement without truth is deception. Positivity without accountability is poison. The hall gasped. Older members of the audience shifted in their seats. Many of them had lived through decades of American change. Wars, recessions, protests. They knew what it meant to long for stability. They knew the cost of silence when truth was needed most. To them, Traoré's words sounded less like criticism and more like a warning. A warning that faith without sacrifice becomes empty. A warning that churches filled with gold while children starve have lost the very soul they claim to protect. He continued, Christianity is not about mansions. It is not about stages and lights. It is about truth and struggle. Christ himself did not promise comfort. He promised a cross. The audience erupted. Some clapped in agreement, some booed, some sat frozen. Social media began to blaze, hashtags trending within minutes. But in that church, in that very moment, the tension was not about technology or politics. It was about a question of faith that could not be ignored. Because when Traoré spoke, he was not just speaking as a president. He was speaking as a soldier who had buried comrades, as a son who had seen mothers cry for lost children, as a man who believed Christianity should not be a business but a sacrifice. His truth collided head-on with the polished optimism of Joel Osteen, creating one of the most explosive confrontations of faith ever seen on live television. And yet the question remained unanswered. The cameras rolled, the world watched, and the silence after his words hung heavier than the lights on stage. The tension inside Joel Osteen's church reached its breaking point. The polished stage lights no longer felt warm and inviting. They felt harsh, almost exposing. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the center, his military jacket slightly unbuttoned, his boots echoing on the floor as he walked across the stage. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried the weight of thunder. Christianity, he declared, was not built on applause. It was built on sacrifice. The early believers were persecuted, hunted, and killed because they stood for truth. And yet today, Christianity has been reduced to entertainment. Megachurches, private jets, and promises of wealth. Is this what Christ died for? Some older men in the front row shook their heads in disbelief. A woman near the back wiped tears from her eyes. Others clapped furiously, their hands trembling with agreement. The divide was visible. Half the room leaning toward Traoré's truth, the other half resisting, uncomfortable with the idea that their faith had been challenged so directly. Social media screens lit up in the crowd. Phones rose in the air, capturing every word. Hashtags like Top Truth in Christianity and Top Traoré Speaks spread within minutes. Viewers across the world typed frantically, some praising him as a prophet of the modern age, others condemning him as an outsider who dared to lecture America on its own soil. And yet Traoré was unmoved. His eyes scanned the crowd not for approval but for understanding. He spoke of the nights in Burkina Faso when families huddled in darkness, praying not for riches but for protection from the sound of gunfire. He reminded them that faith, in its purest form, was not about escaping hardship, but enduring it with courage. Then he posed the question that pierced through the polished walls of prosperity preaching. Even Joel Osteen shifted in his seat, his smile trembling at the edges. And Traoré himself answered, "Comfort without truth is an illusion. Wealth without justice is corruption." Christianity was never meant to be a marketplace, it was meant to be a movement. Christ did not promise riches, he promised a cross. He did not die for men to build empires in his name. He died so that the broken, the poor, and the oppressed could find freedom. And if we forget that, then we have not only lost the faith, we have lost our soul. Gasps filled the air. Some cheered wildly, tears streaming down their faces. Others booed, unable to accept such a direct rebuke of what had become the mainstream face of Christianity in America. A pastor in the second row bowed his head, visibly shaken. A young man raised his phone high and whispered, "This is history." In that moment, Traoré was not just the president of Burkina Faso. He was a mirror held up to the Western Church, reflecting truths many preferred not to see. His words carried images. Children in African villages sharing their last piece of bread, widows giving their last coin, families building schools with their bare hands because leaders had abandoned them. Against those images, the glitter of megachurch stages and golden pulpits seemed painfully hollow. The reaction was not limited to the church. Across Africa, crowds gathered around televisions and radios, watching their young president confront one of the most influential pastors in America. Some wept with pride. Others whispered prayers of protection for him, knowing that truth-tellers often walk dangerous roads. In Washington and Brussels, analysts scribbled notes, recognizing that this was more than religion, it was geopolitics. It was a challenge to the structures of influence that had long shaped nations like Burkina Faso. The climax was not just in his words, but in the ripple they caused. For every cheer inside the church, there was a leader somewhere unsettled. For every tear shed in agreement, there was a critic preparing an attack. But for the ordinary people, those who had endured hunger, those who longed for justice, it was as if someone had finally spoken the words they had carried silently for years. As the applause and protests collided in the same room, one thing was certain. The confrontation had sparked a fire that could not be ignored. Cameras stayed fixed, the world held its breath, and Traoré's steady eyes seemed to challenge not just Joel Osteen, but anyone who had ever traded truth for comfort. The echoes of Ibrahim Traoré's words did not end when the lights of Joel Osteen's church dimmed. In fact, the real storm began the next morning. Clips of the confrontation flooded every platform. YouTube, X, Facebook, each one replayed millions of times. Headlines flashed, "African president challenges America's prosperity gospel," and "Traoré speaks truth to power." For many in Africa, this was a moment of vindication. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in tea shops and roadside cafes, replaying the footage again and again. Elderly men nodded quietly, proud that their young leader had stood unflinching on foreign soil. Mothers spoke of the courage it took for a president of a small, embattled nation like Burkina Faso to confront one of America's most powerful religious figures. For them, it was not just a debate about Christianity, it was a declaration that African voices mattered, even in the heart of America. But the reaction in the West was divided. Some praised Traoré as a prophetic voice calling Christianity back to its roots. Others dismissed him as harsh, uncompromising, even dangerous. American commentators argued on television. Was he a visionary, or was he meddling in matters beyond his scope? Joel Osteen himself, though shaken, tried to remain diplomatic, telling reporters afterward that, "We may not agree on everything, but we must respect each other's passion for God." His smile returned, but the hesitation in his voice revealed the impact the confrontation had left. In Europe, the story took a sharper edge. Analysts in Brussels whispered that Traoré's words were not just about faith, but about sovereignty. For decades, Africa had been seen through the lens of aid, dependency, and quiet submission. Now here was a leader declaring on global television that truth mattered more than wealth, justice more than comfort. To some, it sounded like a spiritual revolution. To others, it sounded like political defiance. The images were unforgettable. A young president in military attire standing against the glitter of American wealth. A church divided between applause and boos, some clapping with tears, others crossing their arms in anger. Screens lighting up across continents, each viewer forced to ask, "What does my faith really mean?" Commentators spoke of it as the night Africa spoke truth to America. Families in rural villages, many without running water or electricity, huddled around radios, listening to translations of their president's voice. For them, it was not just a speech. It was dignity. And yet, in the corridors of power, the reaction was more cautious. Washington officials quietly monitored the fallout, concerned that Traoré's words might spark new debates about aid, influence, and religion in Africa. Intelligence analysts noted that while his message was about Christianity, its undertone was about independence, an Africa no longer willing to accept Western models unchallenged. Amid all the praise and criticism, one truth remained. Traoré had struck a chord that could not easily be silenced. His question is Christianity about comfort and wealth, or about truth, sacrifice, and justice, had spread far beyond Houston. It was now being asked in African villages, European parliaments, and American living rooms. Older audiences, especially in the United States, felt the weight of his challenge. Many had grown up in churches where sacrifice, service, and community were central. Now, watching Traoré's confrontation, they wondered if faith had indeed been softened into something less demanding, less real. Some wrote letters to their pastors. Others sat quietly at kitchen tables, asking themselves whether their faith had been shaped by truth or by convenience. For those in Africa, the moment became a source of hope. If their small nation could produce a leader unafraid to speak before the world, then perhaps the future was not as bleak as the headlines often suggested. For those in the West, it was a moment of discomfort, forcing reflection on whether the global church had traded too much of its soul for applause and prosperity. The night in Houston had ended with applause both divided and uncertain. But the aftermath was clear. A conversation had been started, one that no government, no church, and no media outlet could easily contain. The question now was not whether Traoré's words would be remembered. They already were. The question was whether they would inspire action. In Washington, the confrontation between Ibrahim Traoré and Joel Osteen was not dismissed as a passing church debate. Analysts at think tanks and security agencies quickly drafted reports. For them, this was more than theology. It was geopolitics wrapped in the language of faith. A president of a small African nation had stood on American soil in one of its most famous pulpits and called out not only the misuse of Christianity, but also the moral blind spots of the West. To U.S. officials, the concern was layered. On one hand, they recognized Traoré's words resonated with millions of ordinary people, not just in Africa, but within America itself. Older Americans, veterans, churchgoers, many of them had lived through decades of cultural change. They heard his challenge and quietly admitted he was not wrong. Christianity in America had in many places become a polished product rather than a call to sacrifice. This kind of message could spark new movements, shifts in loyalty, even unrest. On the other hand, there was a geopolitical risk. Burkina Faso is part of the Sahel, a region plagued by terrorism, but also a region where Russia, China, and other powers have sought influence. A leader who could command moral authority on global television was no longer just a local player. He was a voice capable of reshaping alliances, capable of drawing sympathy away from Washington's narrative. The question lingered in U.S. security briefings. If a small country's president can challenge America's spiritual image, what else might he challenge tomorrow? In Europe, the reactions were just as sharp. French commentators, still reeling from Burkina Faso's expulsion of French troops, watched with unease. Here was the same young president who had pushed out foreign armies, now pushing against Western religious models. German analysts warned of a moral vacuum that Western powers had allowed by tying faith too closely to wealth. African leaders in Mali and Niger quietly applauded, seeing in Traoré's stand a reflection of their own struggle for sovereignty. But the most striking reactions came from ordinary people across continents. In American suburbs, elderly couples gathered in Bible study groups, replaying the clip. Some agreed wholeheartedly. He's right. We've forgotten sacrifice. Others felt defensive. He doesn't understand what we do here. Yet even in disagreement, they could not ignore the gravity of his words. In African villages, radios carried his voice into mud-walled homes. Farmers paused from their work to listen. Teachers discussed it with students. For them, the confrontation was not about Osteen. It was about dignity. It was about the world finally hearing that Christianity in Africa was not about show, but about survival, sacrifice, and shared burdens. The global church, too, could not remain silent. Some pastors praised Traoré for speaking what they had been afraid to say. Others condemned him, fearing he had gone too far. But across denominations, the debate spread. Was the church still faithful to its mission, or had it become entangled in comfort, commerce, and compromise? In the midst of all this, security experts in Washington raised an uncomfortable point. When faith itself becomes part of global politics, it touches national security. If American Christianity is seen as commercialized, if its moral credibility weakens, then America's influence weakens too. The battle for hearts and minds, once fought through soft power, was now being challenged from unexpected places. And so the debate that began in a Houston church grew into a global conversation. It was no longer about one pastor and one president. It was about the direction of faith, the stability of nations, and the values that shape societies. The elderly viewer in America, the farmer in Burkina Faso, the policymaker in Europe, all were left asking the same question. Had Christianity strayed too far from its roots? And if so, what would it take to bring it back? The answer, as Traoré had said, would not be found in comfort or wealth, but in truth, sacrifice, and justice. Yet whether the world was ready to accept that answer remained uncertain. The night in Houston was not just another broadcast. It was a moment that shook both faith and politics, a confrontation between comfort and truth, between polished prosperity and raw sacrifice. When President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood before Joel Osteen's congregation, he was not only speaking as a leader of a small African nation, he was speaking as a voice for millions who have carried the weight of suffering in silence. And his words were not easily forgotten. Encouragement without truth is deception. Positivity without accountability is poison. Those sentences echoed far beyond the walls of a megachurch. They echoed into living rooms in America, into villages in Africa, into policy meetings in Europe. They carried both hope and warning. The warning is clear. If Christianity continues down the path of wealth and comfort, it risks losing its very soul. When churches look more like theaters than sanctuaries, when preachers sound more like salesmen than shepherds, the foundation of faith begins to crack. And cracks, if left unattended, become collapse. But the hope is also clear. The soul of Christianity is not yet lost. It still lives in the grandmother in Burkina Faso who kneels each night in prayer. It still lives in the American veteran who quietly helps feed the homeless on Sundays. It still lives in the teacher who shares her last loaf of bread with her students. These are not acts of comfort. They are acts of sacrifice, and sacrifice is the heartbeat of true faith. The future will depend on whether leaders, churches, and nations have the courage to face this truth. Imagine just for a moment, if Christ himself walked into today's world, would he recognize his church? Would he see his love in our streets, his justice in our courts, his humility in our leaders? Or would he see empires built in his name but not in his spirit? The answer will shape not just Christianity, but the stability of societies and the dignity of nations. So the question for each of us remains, will we choose comfort or will we choose truth? Will we cling to wealth or will we embrace justice? Because faith without sacrifice is hollow, and a hollow faith cannot heal a broken world.